Venezuela's armed forces rescued 8 soldiers who were kidnapped by irregular Colombian groups in the border state of Apure. The World Health Organization has approved the Sinovac Covid-19 vaccine for emergency use, the second Chinese jab to receive the agency's green light. Canadian Indigenous groups are urging a nationwide search for mass graves after evidence of genocide was found at a former boarding school run by the Catholic Church. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South, and I'm Katrina Goss. Venezuela's armed forces rescued 8 soldiers who had been kidnapped in the border area by Colombian irregular groups. An operation dubbed Centennial Hawk was launched to rescue the group, kidnapped by unidentified Colombian groups operating in the border state of Apure, where the National Bolivarian Armed Forces of Venezuela are conducting operations, as teleSUR correspondent Madeline Garcia reported on her Twitter account. The 8 were taken from the border town of La Victoria to an airbase in the neighbouring state of Táchira, where they were welcomed by Defence Minister Army General Vladimir Padrino. They were later flown to Caracas for medical checkups. The irregular groups ambushed an army patrol in early May in the context of the 2021 Bolivarian Shield operation against illegal Colombian forces operating on Venezuelan soil. As Colombia enters its second month of nationwide demonstrations, the repression continues. On Monday, police fired tear gas at protesters in a municipality near the capital, Bogota. The National Strike Committee, which brings together a range of trade unions, social and political movements, has once again sat down to attempt to resume negotiations with the government for an end to the protests this Tuesday. The committee continues to call on the government to sign a pre-agreement, including guarantees for the free exercise of the right to peaceful protest, in order to resume talks. Following the deadliest clashes since the mobilisations began last Friday, President Ivan Duque ordered a massive military deployment to the city of Cali, the epicentre of the violence, and the surrounding Valle del Cauca department. The committee continues to call for demilitarisation in order to move forward with any possible negotiations for an end to the mobilisations. Meanwhile, the Regional Strike Committee in the Colombian department of Putumayo denounced police aggression against demonstrators. Riot police attacked as protesters held a solidarity rally on Monday at the Costa Yaco 10 oil well, property of the Canadian transnational Gran Tierra. The rally was held in support of the national strike mobilisations, now in their second month, demanding the dismantling of neoliberal economic and social policies causing inequality and environmental destruction. Also in Putumayo, police violently repressed rural workers who were accompanying their representatives in a meeting with the regional governor. According to local activists, police murdered one of the Putumayo protesters. Young activist Jordani Estrella is the latest victim of Colombian police brutality. He was fatally wounded by security forces while participating in the rally in the department of Putumayo. Since the national strike mobilisations began, the security forces have been implicated in the deaths of over 40 protesters, as recorded by the non-governmental organisation Temblores. The NGO has reported over 1,000 victims of physical violence by police against demonstrators. Likewise, some 30 other homicides are in the process of verification. An Australian court will decide this week on a declassification of intelligence archives about the role played by Australia in overthrowing the Chilean Democratic Socialist government of President Salvador Allende in 1973. The court order is being sought by a former Australian intelligence agent who believes the country helped in overthrowing Allende and imposing a bloody dictatorship. For a long time, it was believed that the military coup of General Augusto Pinochet was imposed on Chile solely on orders from then United States President Richard Nixon on behalf of transnational corporations. But later reports have also implicated the United Kingdom and now Australia. Allende's government lasted only 3 years, in which it nationalised the country's national resources and strategic enterprises and implemented a wide agrarian reform. The Australian court hearing will be held Wednesday and Friday in Sydney. The government resulting from this weekend's election in Peru will have to face an economic crisis aggravated by the pandemic that has left more than 3 million people out of work and increased poverty by 1.8 million, according to the International Monetary Fund. Our correspondent Veronica in Southsea brings us more details about the current situation in the country.
To date, 8 5 out of every 10 workers are in the informal sector. One of the worst consequences of the pandemic was the paralyzation of economic activities, reaching 62% of the gross domestic product. More than 500,000 small and medium-sized businesses went bankrupt.
The economy shrank last year by 11.4%, and obviously this is reflected in the drastic fall in employment, both formal and informal. If we talk about figures, we are referring to 3 million new unemployed, and to this we add the effect of the pandemic on people's health and obviously the lack of health care services by the state.
W.H.O believes that the next government should implement emergency public policies to prioritize the 85% of informal workers over the traditional measures that have not solved the economic crisis.
But the question is whether there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and that is still not there. There is a reactivation plan that has been implemented since May last year, but apparently it has not achieved the expected results, and so people are still waiting for options, and it is in this context that polarization is taking place in the second round of elections here in Peru.
The economic proposals of candidates Fujimori and Castillo are completely opposed. While the candidate of Popular Force insists in keeping the current state of affairs, the leader of Free Peru proposes a model of nationalization and state intervention. The fact is that the country that they are going to take over has a serious institutional problem, and the macroeconomic stability of the last decades has not had any real positive impact on the population, according to The Economist.
That connection is the one that has not occurred in the last 20 years in Peru, because the leaders have not made that kind of reforms, maybe because of corruption. Then the second task is to start implementing those reforms, but such reforms do not have an immediate impact. So what is to be done in the meantime? We will have to design a plan to support small businesses. That's where most jobs are created, provide direct support to the population, because what people do not have is money. They have no money and are desperate because they have nothing to eat.
The new government will inherit a state with a public debt of 36%, weak institutions, and a tax administration body focused on taxing 15% of formal workers out of the entire population. Reactivating the economy of the vast majority at a time of health and economic crisis will be a challenge that will require political consensus beyond political preferences.
Verónica Insausti, teleSUR, Peru.
And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. This Tuesday, the World Health Organization approved the Sinovac Covid-19 vaccine for emergency use, the second Chinese jab to receive the WHO's green light. The United Nations Health Agency signed off on a 2-dose vaccine, which is already being used in several countries around the world. Last month, Sinopharm became the first Chinese vaccine to be approved by the WHO. The organisation has also given emergency use listing to vaccines made by Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. Apart from China, the countries using Sinovac include Chile, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Thailand and Turkey.
I'm happy to announce that the Sinovac Coronavac vaccine has been given WHO emergency use listing after being found to be safe, effective and quality assured following 2 doses of the inactivated vaccine. Furthermore, the easy storage requirements of Coronavac make it very suitable for low-resource settings. It's now the 8th vaccine to receive EUL by WHO.
This Tuesday, Malaysia imposed a total nationwide lockdown to battle a worsening coronavirus outbreak as countries across Southeast Asia struggle with a surge in cases driven by new strains. Much of the region escaped the worst of the pandemic's first wave last year by rapidly closing borders and introducing curbs. However, countries from Thailand to Vietnam are being hit by fresh surges, with efforts to stop outbreaks hampered by slow vaccine rollouts and populations weary of restrictions. Malaysia is among the worst hit, with almost 2,800 COVID-19 deaths recorded in the country since the start of the pandemic, over 40% of which were recorded in May alone. Under the total lockdown, only essential businesses such as supermarkets and medical clinics can operate, and people can only go outside to meet basic needs. On Tuesday, China reported the world's first human infection of a rare bird flu strain, but stated the risk of it spreading widely among people was low. According to a statement by China's National Health Commission, the case concerns a 41-year-old man who was admitted to hospital with fever on April 28th and was diagnosed with the flu strain a month later. The health institution also highlighted that the risk of large-scale spread is extremely low, adding later that the patient was in a stable condition and his close contacts had reported no symptoms. The Health Commission said there had been no human cases of H10N3 previously reported in the world. The last human epidemic of bird flu in China occurred in late 2016 to 2017 with the H7N9 virus. The United States has the world's largest prison population as part of what has been termed its prison industrial complex, which disproportionately affects non-white and poor Americans. Recently, the state of Illinois became the first to eradicate bail, a move sparking hope for many caught up in the system. From Chicago, our correspondent Brian Meir reports.
The United States is the world's largest prison state. 2.3 million people are incarcerated in the U.S., and around 500,000 of them haven't been found guilty of any crime and are merely waiting for their trials to start because they couldn't afford to pay their bail.
The prison industrial complex has exploded in the last 50 years. We lock up, I don't know how many more times more people than we did 50 years ago. We lock up more people than anywhere else in the world, and most of them are not white. All of them are poor, just about.
Recently, due to years of pressure from social movements after entire Latino and African American communities in cities like Chicago were devastated from decades of structural police racism, Illinois became the first state in the union to eradicate bail.
I think overall it will be freeing. People will continue to show up for court. They won't have that financial burden. But I think that what will happen is that judges will find a way to push back. So I think what we'll also see is a number of people who won't have cash bonds, but the judges will decide to hold them on electronic monitoring.
The new law won't come into effect until January 2023, and activists around the country are viewing it with cautious optimism. The hope is that soon the other states will follow and this dark page in American history will be over for good. Brian Meir, teleSUR, Chicago.
And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Canadian Indigenous groups are urging a nationwide search for mass graves after evidence of genocide was found at a former boarding school run by the Catholic Church. 215 Indigenous children were secretly buried in the schoolyard at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia that closed in 1978. Some of the remains were from children as young as 3 years old. Indigenous boys and girls were forced to join these schools run by the church to be assimilated into the culture of British colonial rulers. Denounced as a means of cultural genocide, it now seems the plan was to annihilate them as part of an ethnic cleansing program.
The Kamloops was the home residential school since the 1890, and we all know that many of our consultants and relations came to residential school not by choice, but were students there. And we also do know that many of the students, have went missing as well. And, our consultants, they can definitely share in those stories and have shared in those stories. And, what I've heard from many of them is the fact that, the ones that they know were missing and never came back, were told that they ran away. So, that still haunts. And, a lot of those triggers have popped up with this year find of 215 children.
We are calling on the federal government to do something concrete. The Liberal government can't, on one hand, grieve this horrible tragedy, this horrible loss, while they are still taking Indigenous kids to court, while they're still taking survivors of residential schools to court. So we are calling on Justin Trudeau to stop taking Indigenous kids to court. When a human rights tribunal has found that Canada did not adequately fund Indigenous child welfare, they should not be taking these kids to court.
West African leaders have condemned a second seizure of power by Mali's military in 9 months, suspending the country from the 15-nation Economic Community of West African States. At a crisis summit held in Ghana, the bloc decided to suspend Mali and urged coup leader Assimi Goïta to appoint a new civilian prime minister and forge a new inclusive government. The African leaders stopped short of hitting the country with sanctions to back this demand, a move that they had adopted after a first coup last August. Back then, Goïta led army officers who overthrew elected President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta following protests over perceived corruption and a bloody jihadist insurgency. After the takeover, the military agreed to appoint civilians as interim president and prime minister under the pressure of regional trade and financial sanctions. However, last week, these transitional figures were detained by soldiers before resigning, sparking diplomatic uproar. The Constitutional Court on Friday named Goïta transitional president. And Malians offered their views regarding the naming of Assimi Goïta as president.
See that this country is not advancing at all. It is because of the leaders. If we have a good leader, the country will be better. But as long as we do not have a good leader, the country will not be able to get better. As Assimi Goïta has been appointed president, I was really pleased. To say that Assimi is not going to ensure the presidency of the transition is weak. Assimi only has to do what is right. He just has to get it into his head that the management of the country must be done according to the rules, that he must restore law. I say it again, those who are going to sell the country abroad and sit as leader out of personal interest, we must fight them by all possible means, as long as we do not eliminate them. Even if we bring in Russian weapons, we will not be able to face the adversary because they are unscrupulous people.
More than 90% of people in Ethiopia's war-torn Tigray region need emergency food aid, the United Nations said Tuesday, as it appealed for over $200 million to scale up its response. The UN World Food Programme voiced alarm that the conflict had worsened the food scarcity situation in Tigray. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed sent troops into the northern region in November to detain and disarm leaders of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the region's former ruling party. Though he vowed the conflict would be brief, more than 6 months later fighting continues, reports of atrocities are multiplying, and many leaders are warning of a potential humanitarian catastrophe. The World Food Programme found that as a result of the conflict, almost half of pregnant or breastfeeding mothers in 53 villages were either moderately or acutely malnourished. Almost a quarter of all children screened were found to be malnourished.
In northwestern and southern zones of Tigray region in March, where a total United Nations World Food Programme WFP has provided emergency food assistance to over 1 million people since starting distributions in northwestern and southern zones of Tigray region in March, where a total of 5.2 million people, equivalent to 91% of Tigray's population, need emergency food assistance due to conflict.
Clashes were reported this Monday at the Parliament of the African Union based in South Africa. A heated argument occurred between the deputies of the chamber representing 55 countries of the African continent. The dispute was generated around the ballot box since no agreement was reached on who should be the next president of the chamber. Since the PanAfrican Parliament was formed in 2004, there has never been a president from the south of the continent. The last two came from East Africa. The vote has been suspended for now. In Pakistan, 8 people, including 4 soldiers, were killed and 15 others injured in attacks in the southwestern province of Balochistan. According to a military statement, the attacks took place near the provincial capital Quetta and in the town of Turbat, as Prime Minister Imran Khan was due to visit the region this Tuesday. In the first incident, a security forces checkpoint on the outskirts of Quetta was attacked by gunmen. In the second attack, an improvised explosive device targeted a paramilitary forces vehicle in Tabat, west of Karachi, the country's largest city. Balochistan is Pakistan's largest, least populated and least developed province and has been the site of an armed separatist campaign by rebels for at least a decade. In a statement, the Balochistan Liberation Army claimed responsibility for the attack in Tabat. And we've come to the end of this news brief, but remember you can find these and many of our stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us for all the latest news on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram, and you can catch up on our shows on our YouTube channel. For TeleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss. Thank you for watching.